Greetings, friends. You're looking at my record collection, or at least as part of it. Ken McAuliffe here, the Jazz Vinyl Lover, back one more time. Let me take off these glasses. There I can see. Usually, most jazz people talk about records. They talk about collectible records. They talk about it. They talk about a certain label and the great records on particular labels. Of course, everyone talks about Blue Note, Prestige, Riverside, Impulse, Argo. But I wanted to mention a goodly handful of records that are not hard to find, but records that don't get talked about that much among the jazz canon, as it were. There's so many great jazz records that people just kind of don't ever mention or ever talk about. The work of Beverly Kinney, who's has a big following in Japan, partially because she highly carried herself, but she's a wonderful singer. She's kind of an acquired taste, because some of her singing is a little precious, perhaps. For you Brits out there, maybe she's the swinging version of Alma Cogan, but she's a lot better than that. But she was a wonderful singer, and the weird thing is, every one of her records, she looks slightly different on the cover. It's kind of an oddity. Mint pressings of this go for big money, a few $100. This is the first pressing. They're on Royal Roost, and I just love her singing. She was a great jazz singer, wonderful interpreter. She's somewhat dated of her period, but still she had a beautiful voice. She killed herself at the age of 28. Wonderful singer. And these records are kind of hard to find, just kind of not representing what I'm talking about. This record, in various reissues, is easy to find. And Steve Lacey, I think, is an acquired taste. His tone is a bit much for me sometimes. He's kind of cool avant-garde, but this record is more of a straight-ahead blowing session. And it includes Steve Lacey, Charles Davis, John Orr on bass, and the great Roy Haynes on drums. So it swings really hard, and it's kind of a minimalist thing. I'm not a big fan of his later work, even though I know a lot of people are. But this come out in different versions. This is the original Candid, and I think I paid $20 for this. But a great record, and worth looking for, and not that hard to find. This isn't hard to find at all. Wes, Montgomery, and the great Milt Jackson. And this is just about exactly what you think it would be. Great playing, great swinging. They're having a great time. Not a hard record to find. Riverside with Milt Jackson, Wes Montgomery, Wynton Kelly, Sam Jones, and Philly Joe Jones, 1961. I mean, give me a break. This is a great record. And not that hard to find in reissue status. I guess this is an early Blue Riverside. An easy album to find. I mean, in any decent, I guess in an urban environment, in a decent city, because this was a popular record. James Moody, and the title track is kind of a famous jazz tune, Last Train to Overbrook. Overbrook being the mental institution he checked himself into. And the rest of the album is really great. But the lead track is really the great track. It's really memorable. It almost sounds like a soundtrack theme song. James Moody, Last Train to Overbrook. What year is this? 1958. And this is an original Argo. But if you go to any store that has it gets in jazz records on a regular basis, you will find that record. This is just one of many Paul Motian, Joe Lovano, Bill Frisell trio records on Soul Note. More of them are on ECM, I believe. No, maybe there are more on Soul Note. Maybe that's right. But this is a wonderful group. This is a reissue, so this is easy to find. Comes with the CD. And the communication between these three guys, and Motian was such an unusual drummer. I think he became more unusual the older he got. I interviewed him a few times. He was a hard interview. He did not like being interviewed, didn't want to answer questions. But luckily, I interviewed him once for Downbeat, and Bill Frisell was there and got him to talk. Otherwise, it would have been a totally shitty interview. But a great drummer. And when you first hear Paul Motian in his later years, you're like, what? He sort of sounds like a roller coaster or a Ferris wheel. He's so having so much fun, but he swings so hard, and he's unique. And this is a good one, easy to find. Slightly harder to find. Any of the stuff on Soul Note. Even though I'm thinking a lot of his catalog stuff is better known on ECM. One of my favorite records I don't have is Motion in Monk, I think that's what it's called, where with the famous trio they play Monk tunes, and whoa, that's one of the first records I ever heard when I was getting into jazz. And I think I bought Nefertiti by Miles, and then Monk in Motion. And it was, I mean, talk about a bunch of deranged, time-waving, rhythm-quaking tunes. Everybody playing very freely, but playing extremely melodically and playing for the music. This is just one example of the great Paul Motion, Mysterioso. Who's on this record? I haven't listened to this in a while. Joe Lovano, Bill Frisell, Ed Schiller, Jim Pepper. This is probably a little bit harder to find, but any Paul Motion record is a great record to have. The great Ralph Peterson. When these records came out in the 90s, they were kind of revolutionary, I thought, because he played with the fire of Monk. And, I mean, his tunes were like Monk tunes, and he had the fire of Art Blakey. Really memorable tunes. He did 5 or 6 records for Blue Note Japan, and they own the masters, hence Blue Note US won't release them. But this, I mean, this is a really exciting, dynamic jazz record. A lot of fun. Ralph Peterson Quintet. I think Jerry Allen was in the group back then. Jerry Allen, Phil Bowler, Steve Wilson, and Terrence Blanchard. I mean, top rate. And if you can find it, it won't cost you much because people don't really care. And Ralph's had a lot of health problems, but he continues to make great music. Another record, not hard to find, but one of my favorites, and more important than ever now, the George Duke records on MPS, The Aura Will Prevail. They were reissued last year. To me, they're a big influence on the modern jazz coming out of the West Coast. Thundercat, Justin Brown's latest record with NYC. You know, because of the whole resurgence of quote-unquote spiritual jazz and Kamasi Washington, records like this are where all that stuff came from, as well as the Eilers and all that stuff. This is where the funk comes from. A lot of records then Duke Chancellor on drums. And this is, you know, George Duke got such an amazing organic sound on synthesizers. And I was given this record by Kenny Wollesen. I never heard it before. But one, I mean, it's funky. It's not really fusion. It's more like jazz funk in that particular way that George Duke would play the stuff. If you hear later George Duke, you got really commercial. But the early stuff in MPS, I think there's 4 records, are just fantastic. Funky, liquid, swinging, and a lot of fun. Nobody talks a lot about Duke Ellington anymore. I work at the Jazz Record Center on Saturdays, as you know, and nobody buys Duke Ellington records. It's kind of strange because there are tons of Duke Ellington records, and this is just one of many. Anatomy of a Murder, just top flight Ellington, beautiful, descriptive, illustrative, powerful, extremely well played. There's a handful of, 10 greatest Duke records everybody should have. Masterpieces, the Blanton Webster Orchestra, I think the Blues in Orbit record, a few other ones, but this is one of those records. And this is a Columbia 6i, but you can find it in different reissues. And just a great, if you don't have any Duke Ellington records, any of them are worth starting with, but this is one of my favorites. And a record that really amazed me at the time, Ed Thigpen on Verve, Out of the Storm. I don't know who he worked with on this record, but it's a classic recording, great compositions, great arranging. It's not a drummer's record, as some drumming can be, where the tunes are kind of flashy to show off the drummer. This is not like that at all. But Ed Thigpen was one of the masters of playing brushes, so maybe that explains part of it. Very subtle, extremely musical. This is a record that will cost you like $8 when you find it. I guess part of it's the lineup. Kenny Burrell, Clark Terry, Herbie Hancock, and Ron Carter. Holy crap. But who was the, it's a Rudy Van Gelder record, 1966. It's a really unusual record because you put it on and you don't think drummer's record. It's just a great record. Even to this day I put it on, I'm kind of surprised because the drums are not the focus. Not that all drumming records are the focus, but you know what I'm saying. There are a slew of Red Garland records, and many of them I find a little boring, but these two are not. Red and Blues, Red Garland on Prestige, on Status rather, the budget label, both on Status, the budget label of Prestige, and All Morning Long with Coltrane. These are sometimes, I don't want to say Red Garland, he's so talented he just phones it in, but on some of the records they're just not, they don't quite do it. But these two, which are primarily trio records, are worth searching out for, or worth searching out. A little off the beaten path, people might not think it's jazz. The Kip Hanrahan records that came out in the 90s, very smoky, dark, film noirish, New York City, barrio, rhythmic, a lot of Latin percussion, beautiful. I mean, his early records have both Carmen Lundy and I think Cassandra Wilson singing on them, and they're concept records. Everything on his label Pangea was very concept oriented and very, to me, nocturnal New York City music, you know, of the 90s or the 80s, before our city was destroyed by money and greed. And then finally, a record you'll find that costs next to nothing. People, I think he played with Ellington, Jimmy Hamilton, a tenor saxophone player, on Prestige Swingville. Swingville's a cool label, just like you had the Prestige had another offshoot. What was it? It was kind of like their version of like Cool Records, late night records. But this is a great record. Jimmy Hamilton, Tommy Flanagan, Wendell Marshall, Earl Williams. This is a record I've tried to get rid of many times, you know, when you're purging records. And I'd put it on and go, wow, this guy swings his ass off. And this is what great playing. And it's just one of those records that flies under the radar that people don't really think about. And there's a bunch of them. And like perhaps this is part one of a thing I'll do of great records that don't cost much, that are worth searching out. Anyway, Ken McAllister, the Jazz Vinyl Lover. You can read all my scribbles and nonsense at a Stereophile and Downbeat, and I'm back in Jazz Times. And documenting the life of the New York writer. Now I'm off to lunch. Have a great day. Thanks for checking in. Bye-bye.